It was 4 a.m. on November 13th, 2022. While most of Moscow, Idaho was asleep, 4 college students were being stabbed to death inside their own home. No alarm was triggered, no neighbors called 911, no one heard screams. And for the next 6 weeks, the killer walked free. He drove to a DMV 5 days after the murders, casually changed his license plates, and carried on with his PhD studies just 10 miles from where he killed 4 people. But one piece of evidence he didn't count on: 7 skin cells on a tan leather knife sheath left on one of the victims' beds. That DNA would lead investigators 2,500 miles away to a quiet suburb in Pennsylvania. And on July 2nd, 2025, Bryan Kohberger stood in an Idaho courtroom and pleaded guilty to all 4 murders. He was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences, plus 10 years for burglary. He will die in prison. This is the full story of the Idaho murders.
Before we talk about the killer, you need to know who he took. Because what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that someone had been watching their house for months. Kaylee Goncalves was 21 years old. She was days away from graduating with a degree in general studies. She had just accepted a job offer in Austin, Texas. She was planning her entire future. She had a dog named Murphy that she shared with her ex-boyfriend. She was the kind of person who made everyone around her laugh. Madison Mogen, Maddie, was also 21. She was Kaylee's best friend since high school. The two had been inseparable for years. That night, they'd been out together, just like any other weekend. Maddie was studying marketing. She worked at a Greek restaurant in town. Xana Kernodle was 20 years old. She was in a relationship with the 4th victim, Chapin. They were the kind of couple everyone around them loved. Xana was studying marketing. She posted on Instagram just hours before she died. Chapin was also 20. He was a freshman, a triplet. He was studying recreation, sport, and tourism management. He lived in a fraternity house across campus. He wasn't supposed to be at the house that night, but he stayed over to be with Xana. 4 friends, 1 house, 1 night. And 2 other roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, were home that night, on the 1st floor. They survived. And what Dylan saw, and what she didn't do for 8 hours, would become one of the most controversial details of the entire case. But to understand why, we need to go back to that night. Here's what we know about the night of November 12th into November 13th, 2022. All 5 roommates and Chapin were in the house by 2 a.m. Ethan and Xana had been at a party at the Sigma Chi fraternity house on campus. They returned home at 1:45 a.m. Kaylee and Maddie had been at a downtown sports bar called the Corner Club. Then they went to a food truck called the Grub Truck. Surveillance footage shows them ordering pasta at 1:45 a.m., smiling, laughing. They got home at 1:56 a.m. What they didn't know was that a white sedan had been circling the area for hours. Surveillance cameras would later capture it, driving past the house, slowing down, turning around. Between 2:26 and 2:52 a.m., Kaylee and Maddie's phones made several unanswered calls to Kaylee's ex-boyfriend, a fellow student. We don't know why, but it wasn't him. By 4 a.m., Xana received a DoorDash food order. She was still awake, still on her phone. At 4:12 a.m., she was using TikTok. That's important because it means she was alive at 4:12 a.m. By 4:25 a.m., all 4 of them were dead. Detectives believe all 4 murders occurred between 4 and 4:25 a.m. 25 minutes, 4 people stabbed to death. And the 2 surviving roommates, Dylan and Bethany, were downstairs the entire time. Dylan Mortensen was asleep in her bedroom on the 2nd floor when she was woken up by a noise on the 3rd floor. She thought it was Kaylee playing with her dog. Then she heard someone say, "There's someone here." Dylan thought it was Kaylee's voice, but investigators believe it may have been Xana. Dylan opened her door. She didn't see anything. She closed it. Then she heard what sounded like crying coming from Xana's room. She opened her door again, and she heard a male voice say, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." Security cameras near the house picked up the sound of whimpering, a loud thud, and a dog barking, starting around 4:17 a.m. Dylan opened her door a 3rd time, and she saw him. A figure, dressed in black, wearing a mask that covered his mouth and nose. He walked toward her, past her, and exited through the sliding glass door in the kitchen. Dylan stood frozen. She later told police she was in a frozen shock phase. She locked herself in her room, and she didn't call 911. At approximately 4:26 a.m., Dylan went downstairs to join Bethany. On the way, she saw Xana lying on the floor of her bedroom. Dylan later told police she thought Xana was drunk. The 2 surviving roommates locked themselves in Bethany's bedroom, and they spent hours trying to contact their other housemates. They got no response. Later that morning, still nothing. So Dylan called friends over for help. One of the friends went to the 2nd floor. He found Ethan and Xana. No pulse. He told everyone to get out of the house. Bethany called 911 at 11:55 a.m., requesting aid for an unconscious person. It had been nearly 8 hours since Dylan saw the masked man leave. All 4 victims were pronounced dead that afternoon. Xana Kernodle was found on the floor of her bedroom. Ethan Chapin was in her bed. Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalves were found together in a single bed in Maddie's room on the 3rd floor. All 4 had been stabbed to death. None of them had been sexually assaulted. None of them had been restrained. But the brutality was extreme. Kaylee had more than 20 stab wounds, in addition to injuries connected with asphyxiation and blunt force trauma. Xana had more than 50 stab wounds. Many of them were defensive wounds. She fought back. The Moscow Police Department led the investigation, with support from the Idaho State Police and the FBI. Nearly 130 law enforcement personnel worked the case, and for 6 weeks, the public heard almost nothing. What followed was one of the most tense periods in modern American true crime history. Moscow is a small town, about 25,000 people. Word spread fast. Parents were pulling their kids out of the university. Students were sleeping with the lights on. Businesses were selling out of door locks and security cameras. And police, for weeks, said almost nothing publicly. On November 19th, the Moscow police requested the public provide any video of the house from the night of the murders. A phone tip line and email address were created through the FBI. By December 5th, authorities had received 2,600 emailed tips, 2,700 phone calls, and 1,000 digital media submissions. By December 24th, over 15,000 tips. Police initially left open the possibility of multiple perpetrators. They said it appeared to be a targeted attack, but they didn't know if the target was the residents or the people inside. On November 23rd, the Moscow police chief held a press conference. He said they'd received tips that Kaylee Goncalves had a stalker.
but they couldn't verify it, and they couldn't identify anyone. That claim received a lot of press attention at the time, but it was never mentioned again in the case against the eventual suspect. Here's what was actually happening behind the scenes. Investigators were reviewing hundreds of hours of surveillance footage, and they found something. A camera in the area had captured video of a white or light-colored sedan around the time of the murders. It wasn't just passing by, it made multiple passes along the same route, near the residence. Another surveillance recording showed the same car passing the victim's home 3 times, beginning around 3:29 a.m. At 4:04 a.m., it returned for a 4th time. At 4:20 a.m., right around the time the murders ended, the car was seen speeding away from the neighborhood. On December 15th, police announced they were searching records of approximately 22,000 white Hyundai Elantras made between 2011 and 2013. Thousands of tips came in, but one stood out. Investigators in Pullman, Washington, a college town just 8 miles west of Moscow, began investigating a white Elantra owned by a 28-year-old PhD student. His name, Bryan Kohberger. Kohberger was a teaching assistant at Washington State University. He was in his first semester of a PhD program in criminology. Let that sink in. The man studying how criminals think was about to become the suspect. And when investigators pulled his records, they found something chilling. Cell phone data showed that Kohberger's phone had pinged from the cell tower nearest the victim's residence at least 12 times between June 2022 and November 13th. He had no known connection to any of the victims. He didn't go to their school, he didn't work with them, he wasn't friends with them on social media. So why was he circling their house? And here's where it gets worse. On the night of the murders, his phone stopped connecting to the network in Pullman at 2:47 a.m. It didn't reconnect until 4:48 a.m. near Blaine, Idaho, which is south of Moscow along US Highway 95. His phone was off for 2 hours, covering the entire window of the murders. And then, at 9 a.m. on November 13th, approximately 5 hours after the killings, his phone connected to a cell tower near the victim's residence again. He came back. Bryan Kohberger was 28 years old. He had moved to Washington in the summer of 2022 to pursue a PhD at Washington State University in Pullman. He was studying criminology, the psychology of criminals, how they think, how they're caught. He was a teaching assistant. But less than 2 weeks before the murders, faculty members at WSU met with him to discuss growing concerns and complaints about his behavior and conduct toward women. On December 19th, 11 days before his arrest, Kohberger was terminated from his teaching assistant role. The decision was based on his behavior and performance overall. Former classmates described him as awkward, intense, obsessive. Kohberger himself wrote online that he faced mental health challenges. He said he suffered from tinnitus and a condition called visual snow syndrome. His defense team would later claim he had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, but the judge presiding over his case said he had never seen any odd behavior from Kohberger during hearings. He called him highly functioning. In mid-December, Kohberger drove cross-country to his parents' home in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. His father flew out to drive back with him, and on the way, they were pulled over, twice. In Indiana, on Interstate 70 near Greenfield, Kohberger was stopped twice within a nearly 5-mile radius for following too close, tailgating. Body cam footage shows the stop. Kohberger is polite, calm. His hands are visible. The officer asks if they're headed home for the holidays. Kohberger says yes. Nothing about his behavior stands out.
Except one thing: he's wearing surgical gloves in the middle of December. The FBI later denied that it had directed Indiana State Police to make those stops, but by that point, Kohberger was already under surveillance. Investigators had begun monitoring his parents' home in Monroe County, Pennsylvania, and they saw something strange. Kohberger was seen multiple times wearing surgical gloves and placing trash bags inside a neighbor's garbage can. The items were retrieved and sent to the Idaho State Lab for testing. Authorities also said Kohberger cleaned his car inside and outside, not missing an inch. But investigators still needed to confirm the DNA, so they waited. And on December 30th, 2022, Bryan Kohberger took out the trash one more time. At 3 a.m., Pennsylvania State Police CERT and the FBI surrounded the house. They found Kohberger in the kitchen, dressed in a shirt and shorts, wearing examination gloves, putting trash into separate Ziploc baggies. He was arrested without incident. A search of the home revealed a knife, a gun, a black face mask, and ID cards inside a glove in a box. When he appeared in court for the first time on January 5, 2023, he said nothing, just stared ahead, expressionless. And that's when the nation got its first real look at the man accused of killing 4 people. Let's talk about the evidence, because this is where the case gets complicated. The DNA, the car, the phone data, the eyewitness. Some of it is damning. Some of it raises questions. And before we talk about the guilty plea, you need to understand what each piece actually proved and what it didn't. Let's start with the DNA. Investigators found DNA on a tan leather knife sheath that was left on Madison Mogen's bed. The DNA came from skin cells, 7 of them, on the button snap of the sheath. Touch DNA is exactly what it sounds like: DNA left behind when someone touches an object. Skin cells, sweat, oils from your hands. But here's the problem with touch DNA. It can transfer. If you shake someone's hand, then touch a doorknob, your DNA is now on that doorknob. So the defense could argue, how do we know when that DNA was deposited? Could it have been transferred? Could someone else have touched the sheath after Kohberger? It's a fair question, but here's the problem for the defense. The sheath was found on a victim's bed in a house Kohberger had no known reason to enter. And the DNA wasn't just on the sheath, it was on the snap, the part you'd touch if you were putting the knife away. So the question becomes, why would Kohberger's DNA be on a knife sheath found at a murder scene? Before we go any further, if you're finding this as detailed as we aimed for, go ahead and subscribe right now. We cover cases like this every week. Full story, full detail, full psychology, no fluff. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. Now, the genealogy investigation. But DNA is only useful if you have someone to match it to. And at first, investigators didn't. The DNA had no matches in the National Law Enforcement Database, CODIS, so they turned to genealogical DNA matching. Law enforcement used ancestral genealogical websites, GDmatch and MyHeritage, which included DNA samples from people who had not opted in to law enforcement searches. This was done contrary to a Justice Department policy that says investigators should only use DNA samples from databases that provide explicit notice to their service users and the public that law enforcement may use their service sites. The FBI violated that policy. But it worked. They identified a match with 250 shared centimorgans of DNA, a much closer relative. A few days later, investigators began monitoring Kohberger's parents' home, and when they pulled his trash and tested it against the DNA from the knife sheath, they got a familial match, meaning the DNA on the sheath belonged to a close male relative of Kohberger's father. In other words, Bryan Kohberger. Now let's talk about the car.
Surveillance footage from multiple cameras shows a white sedan consistent with a 2011 to 2013 Hyundai Elantra driving near the house between 3:29 and 4:20 a.m. Bryan Kohberger owned a white 2015 Hyundai Elantra. Close, but not exact. The defense could argue there were thousands of white Elantras. How do we know it was his? Fair point, but when you combine the car with the phone data, the picture sharpens.
Between June 2022 and November 13th, Kohberger's phone pinged from the cell tower nearest the victim's house at least 12 times. Not in the neighborhood, not in the general area, near the house. He had no known connection to the victims. He didn't go to their school, he didn't work there, he wasn't friends with them on social media. So why was he there? And here's the detail that investigators couldn't ignore. On the night of the murders, his phone stopped connecting to the network at 2:47 a.m. It stayed off for 2 hours, covering the entire window of the murders. Then, at 4:48 a.m., it turned back on, south of Moscow, heading away from the scene. The defense could say, maybe he was sleeping, maybe his phone died. But consider this. Investigators checked months of records. His phone had never turned off at that hour before. The one night it went dark, the night 4 people were murdered. And then there's the eyewitness. Dylan Mortensen, the surviving roommate, described the man she saw as an athletic build, bushy eyebrows, dressed in black, wearing a mask. When police arrested Kohberger, he matched that description. But here's the problem. She didn't see his face. She saw his eyebrows in the dark, while in shock. Is that enough to identify someone beyond a reasonable doubt? The prosecution believed that combined with the DNA, the car, and the phone data, it was overwhelming. And on July 2nd, 2025, Bryan Kohberger seemed to agree. On December 30th, 2022, Bryan Kohberger was arrested and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. He was extradited back to Idaho. He was held without bail. On January 5th, 2023, he made his first appearance in court. On May 17th, 2023, he was indicted by a grand jury on all 5 charges. In May 2023, during his arraignment, Kohberger refused to enter a plea. His attorney said he was standing silent on the charges. The judge entered a not guilty plea for him. On June 26, 2023, the Latah County Prosecutor's Office announced they were seeking the death penalty, given the aggravating circumstances of the first-degree murder charges. Kohberger was denied bond. In September 2024, the judge granted the defense's motion for a change of venue. The trial was scheduled to take place in Boise, with jury selections set to begin on August 4th, 2025, and the trial starting on August 18th, 2025. But on June 30th, 2025, an announcement was made that shocked everyone. Bryan Kohberger agreed to plead guilty to all counts against him. In exchange for the guilty plea, the prosecution agreed to drop the death penalty. Kohberger accepted 4 consecutive life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 10 years for burglary. He also gave up his right to any future appeals. On July 2nd, 2025, Bryan Kohberger stood in an Idaho courtroom and pled guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. 3 weeks later, on July 23, 2025, he was sentenced. At the sentencing hearing, the families of the victims were finally allowed to speak. Kaylee's father said his daughter had lived more in 21 years than most people do in a lifetime. Madison's mother said the words "life sentence" would never feel like enough.
Ethan's family said justice had been served, but the pain never goes away. Xana's mother looked directly at Kohberger and said 6 words, "You will die in that prison." Bryan Kohberger showed no emotion. He stared ahead, expressionless. The judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life sentences in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 10 years for burglary. He was also ordered to pay a combined fine of $250,000, $50,000 per count, and $20,000 in restitution, $5,000 per victim. Bryan Kohberger is currently incarcerated. He will never be released. He will die in prison. But the guilty plea left many questions unanswered because Kohberger never explained why he did it. He never gave a motive. He never showed remorse. He never spoke about the victims. He just pleaded guilty, and that was it. So the question remains, why?
This is where most channels stop. They show you the evidence, the timeline, the arrest, the guilty plea, and they move on. But this is True Crime Buried, and we don't just ask what happened, we ask why. And we've only just started digging. Bryan Kohberger studied criminology. He was a PhD student. He was learning how criminals think, how they plan, how they're caught. And then he became the very thing he was studying. So let's dig in. First question, why would someone studying crime commit crime? It sounds paradoxical, but it's not unheard of. Ted Bundy studied psychology. He volunteered at a suicide hotline. He worked on a rape crisis counseling team. Dennis Rader, BTK, was a compliance officer. He studied security systems. Joseph James D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, was a police officer. Criminal psychologists call this the insider's advantage. When you study how crimes are solved, you also learn how not to get caught. And based on the evidence and his guilty plea, Kohberger fits that pattern. He knew how DNA worked. He knew how phone data was tracked. He knew how surveillance footage was analyzed. And he tried to avoid all of it. His phone turned off during the murders. He wore gloves on his drive home. He cleaned his car obsessively. He left the knife sheath, but not the knife. Was he careful, or did he make mistakes?
Now let's talk about the crime itself. This was a targeted, high-risk attack. 4 victims, 2 surviving witnesses in the house, a neighborhood with security cameras. This wasn't opportunistic. This wasn't random. Criminal psychologists look at crimes like this and ask, what does the behavior tell us? In this case, high planning, stalking the house for months, high risk, multiple victims, witnesses present, low reward, no robbery, no sexual assault, no clear financial motive. So what was the motive? Kohberger never said. The prosecution never announced one. The defense never offered one. And that's the question that haunts this case. Why? Some criminologists have speculated it could be fantasy fulfillment, living out a scenario he'd studied, obsession with one of the victims, though no evidence supports this, challenge, proving he could commit the perfect crime, power and control, the need to dominate and destroy. But these are theories, not facts. And here's the detail that investigators couldn't let go of. He came back. According to cell phone data, Bryan Kohberger's phone pinged near the house again on the morning of November 13th, hours after the murders. He drove past the scene while police were there. Criminal psychologists call this returning to the scene. It's a known phenomenon. Offenders do it to relive the crime, monitor the investigation, feel a sense of control. Based on the evidence, this is what Kohberger did. He studied crime, he planned crime, he committed crime, and then he came back to watch.
Shortly after Kohberger's arrest, Carrie Rawson, the daughter of serial killer Dennis Rader, also known as BTK, spoke publicly about the case. She said that learning of Kohberger's interest in criminology sank her stomach. It reminded her of her father, who had worked in law enforcement and studied security systems while committing murders. Experts noting that complex criminals often develop an interest in criminology or criminal justice. They study it, they work in it, and sometimes they use it. But here's what we still don't know, and may never know. Why did Bryan Kohberger choose those 4 people? Why that house? Why that night? And here's the bigger question. Can someone truly understand evil without being consumed by it? Or does the act of studying darkness pull you into it?
Even with a guilty plea, there are questions this case has never fully answered. Why them? Kohberger's phone pinged near the house 12 times in the months before the murders, but he had no known connection to any of the victims. So why was he watching them? There are unconfirmed reports that Kohberger may have matched with one of the victims on a dating app months before, but this has never been officially confirmed. There are also reports that he had been following some of the victims on social media, but again, never confirmed. What about these surviving roommates? Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, who were home that night, have spoken very little publicly. What they experienced in those hours between the murders and the 911 call is something only they will ever fully know. And here's the detail that still haunts people. Dylan saw the masked man leave. She locked her door, and she didn't call 911 for 8 hours. Before you judge her, consider this. She was 19 years old, in shock, possibly in denial. She later told police she was intoxicated and didn't want to believe what was happening. The brain does strange things when it's trying to process trauma it can't comprehend. But the question remains, could the murders have been stopped if she'd called 911 immediately? We'll never know.
On February 24, 2023, the University of Idaho president announced that the house where the murders occurred had been donated to the university. It was demolished 10 months later, in December 2023. In 2024, a memorial garden for the victims opened on the University of Idaho campus. It's called the Vandal Healing Garden. Scholarships have been created in the names of Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin, and Madison Mogen. On May 13, 2023, the University of Idaho awarded posthumous degrees to all 4 victims at its spring commencement ceremonies. In 2025, Amazon Prime Video released a documentary series called One Night in Idaho: The College Murders. It was produced by Amazon MGM Studios and Skydance Television. It premiered on July 10, 2025, just 8 days after Kohberger's guilty plea. On November 19, 2025, it was reported that the Goncalves family was planning to sue Washington State University. They're seeking accountability and transparency due to Kohberger's conduct before the murders. Remember, less than 2 weeks before the killings, faculty members at WSU met with Kohberger to discuss growing concerns and complaints about his behavior and conduct toward women. He was terminated from his teaching assistant role on December 19th, 11 days before his arrest. The Goncalves family wants to know, what did the university know, and when did they know it? In January 2026, Bryan Kohberger's sister spoke publicly about the case for the first time since his arrest and sentencing. She said the family had been shocked by his arrest. They had no prior knowledge of his involvement in the murders. But the question many people are asking is this: how could they not know? How could someone plan and execute 4 murders and the people closest to him not see it coming?
The answer is simple, because some people are very good at hiding who they really are.
Kaylee Goncalves was 21 years old. She was going to move to Texas. She had a dog named Murphy. She was the kind of person who made everyone around her laugh. She deserved to graduate. She deserved her future. Madison Mogen was 21 years old. She was Kaylee's best friend since high school. She worked at a Greek restaurant. She was studying marketing. She deserved to live. She deserved her dreams. Kaylee Xana Kernodle was 20 years old. She was in love. She had just gotten a new job. She posted on Instagram hours before she died. She deserved to grow old. She deserved to be happy. Ethan Chapin was 20 years old. He was a triplet. He was studying tourism. He wasn't even supposed to be there that night. He deserved to go home. He deserved to see his family again. Remember Kaylee. Remember Madison. Remember Xana. Remember Ethan. This is True Crime Buried. We don't just tell you what happened, we dig deeper to find the why. But in this case, the why is still unanswered. Bryan Kohberger pleaded guilty, but he never explained why he did it. He never gave a motive. He never showed remorse. He never spoke about the victims. He just pleaded guilty, and that was it. So here are the questions we're left with. Why did Bryan Kohberger kill 4 people he didn't know? What drives someone who studies the criminal mind to become the very thing he's studying? And can someone truly understand evil without being consumed by it? This case is over. Bryan Kohberger will die in prison, but the questions it raises about obsession, about violence, about the mind, those questions remain. Drop a comment below. What was the detail that shocked you most? Was it the DNA? The 12 phone pings? The fact that he came back to the scene? And if you want to see more deep dives like this, subscribe. We've only just started digging. I'll see you in the next one.